Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Warren, past president of the COA, and it's my pleasure to preside over this next session, which is returning to physical education after concussion. And our presenters, to give you a little background, we have Dr. Brian Rieger from Upstate Medical, and we have Matt Murphy from Fayetteville Elementary, and they're going to be our presenters today and give us a good synopsis of what we should be looking at re-entering into physical education. So, I would remind everyone to sign in to the chat. And at that point, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
Great, thank you, Greg. And thank you, Ron and the COA for having Matt and I here. We're as interested in hearing from you all today as I hope you are interested in hearing from us. We've been talking about return to sports for a long time, but I myself, as a person working in a concussion clinic, have struggled over the years with the issue of returning youth, students, athletes or not, to physical education. And it's been a struggle. And I've come to realize some of the reasons behind that struggle, and have been fortunate enough to work with Matt, Ron, and some others on our Brain Injury Association of New York, that's BIANUS, Concussion Initiative Work Group, looking at this issue of return to physical education. And so Matt and I have been working with this group to develop some initial sort of proposed guidelines, similar to a return to play or a return to learn, regular sort of return to learn. We're trying to develop guidelines to better structure the return to physical education and make it more successful for the student, for the school, for the physical educator, the parents, etc. So here's the group of people that we've been working with. And there's also the Brain Injury Association Concussion Initiative, which is a 5-year, probably go longer than that, initiative to try to improve management of concussion across the state, including for youth, for students, for athletes. So we've been working on this, and what I'm gonna do today is my role really is to sort of cover my area of expertise, which is kind of principles of concussion and concussion management. And, you know, Denny, probably the biggest difference than when you and I started this many, many years ago is we were really focused on return to play. You and Lloyd always recognized when you talked to me how return to learn was just as important. And I think we've done a good job of that. But I think actually return to learn PE is really still kind of an opportunity for us, because I don't think we've got good guidelines there. So I'm going to give the background on what's already going on in concussion, and then we're going to turn it over to Matt to sort of outline, you know, I mean, turn it over to you guys as professionals in the physical education, not me, to sort of go through some of that. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick, and hopefully leave us some good time for discussion. Again, we really want to be hearing reactions and feedback to this. So be critical, help us make this, you know, sort of into a draft that we can really start to get out there. To begin with, you know, concussion and mild traumatic brain injury are used synonymously. Experts generally consider concussion to fall on the milder end of the mild TBI or mild traumatic brain injury spectrum. But either way, the real thing about a concussion is it's a problem in the brain's functioning due to a blow or jolt to the head. And what's important is there's no medical test to diagnose it. You can't see it on a CT scan or an MRI. The way we know someone's had a concussion is their brain's not working right. And the way we know that is because how they tell us how they feel, or how we observe their functioning, their balance, or they tell us they have a headache. But it's a tricky thing because we don't have that nice, hard medical test. And anybody who's, you know, been around athletics and concussed athletes and trying to make those on-field quick decisions knows how tricky this can be sometimes. Sometimes it's easy, but sometimes not. So we have a bunch of very typical symptoms that we usually see, but we don't always see all these symptoms. People have different groups of these symptoms. And again, all of these symptoms can be caused by something else. A neck injury or dehydration or, overheating. So, a lot of these symptoms aren't specific. So it's challenging, but we have pretty good idea about how to recognize it. And we definitely know that when we do see a concussion, we got to treat it seriously. I don't think anybody's arguing that anymore. But being a student with a concussion, again, there's so much focus on sports with concussion, but for you all, we're dealing with student athletes and we're dealing with students who get concussions from non-sports. And being a kid in school with concussion is no fun. The environment, having to concentrate, anything that puts a demand or stress on the brain can aggravate the concussion symptoms. And this is an important point about concussion in general. And one of the hallmarks of concussion is that the symptoms worsen with any kind of demand on the brain. Thankfully, most people overall are recovered from concussion fairly quickly, but high school kids actually take the longest time to recover. 2 to 4 weeks is considered a normal recovery, which if you think about it, what other injury or illness this common has that lengthy of a recovery, really? The flu is a good week. Maybe if you break a bone, it's 6 weeks for a kid, but this is that can be a pretty significant period of time, especially in high school, and especially if you're a strong student with a busy schedule. And up to 20% of kids will still have symptoms at 3 months, some longer than that. And it's really these youth in particular that Matt and I are focusing on. When this goes really fast and you're recovered in a week, well, there isn't a lot of stress going on with the teachers, the student. They can make up a couple of days out of school, but when you're going 2 to 4 weeks and are you in school? Are you in school half time? Who knows? This can be a real challenge, including for physical education. And we know that for those kids that do take longer to recover, factors other than the injury really can play a big role, including all the stress of the situation that just then turns around and makes it harder to recover. So anything we can do to reduce that stress and to support these students is actually going to help their recovery. When students don't feel like they get the support they need so often, they look normal, they wake up in the morning, they may even feel normal and think, yeah, what's your problem? Just go to school. And then, by the middle of the day, they're really sucking wind. They're tired, they've got a headache, they want to rest, but, they don't want to tell anybody about it because people are going to make fun of them or people don't get it, and there's always those kids who want a little attention, but most kids would prefer to fly under the radar. Most adolescents don't want to bring this kind of attention to themselves. So many of them will not automatically on their own seek help or ask for help. And they certainly won't do it if they are in a culture that's making them feel like they're just faking it anyway. So, this is a significant challenge with concussion. Again, it starts on the medical side where we don't even have a diagnosis that we can definitively tell a person they've had a concussion. We're pretty confident when we say it, but really we never know. And without that kind of concrete stuff, it's just one of these things that makes this injury different from some others. What we know is that the stress of that situation is one of the factors that can complicate recovery. Just dealing with the injury, falling behind in school, being out of sports, being isolated, not feeling good. There's a lot of struggle there. And what we definitely know, and this is the thing that everybody knows, we don't want to send kids back to any risky activities before they're recovered, because if you get another concussion before you're recovered from one that you've already had, that's like the worst situation. Now you're definitely going to be in our clinic and be having, symptoms for weeks and months and on and on. So, but we're pretty good at this point of recognizing and managing that, with the exception of those crazy parents, the occasional coach who's maybe a little too rambunctious about it. But in general, I think we understand that. What people don't understand as much is that making the brain do mental activity or being in a stimulating environment or being under some kind of psychological stress can also aggravate symptoms and complicate the recovery. And sometimes these symptoms, these problems become so significant that a child will develop an anxiety disorder or become depressed. I'm doing a talk later this week for child psychiatry here at Upstate. And the sort of interaction between concussion and psychiatric symptoms and conditions is quite strong because it's the brain. One of the symptoms of a concussion is you don't deal with stress well, right when your stress levels go way up, especially in high school kids, again, who are maybe good students, good athletes. You put the two of those together and you can end up with a very significant mental health problem. Not to mention a student who's feeling misunderstood in school, feeling like they're failing and falling behind. So we really want to recognize how these, it's not just the injury, it's the circumstances, the event, the environment that are at play here. And when we think about what does aggravate concussion symptoms, basically the best example of that is spend a day in school. Crowds, noise, motion, concentration, physical exertion, walking upstairs, 40-pound backpack on your back. There's a lot of things that go on in the school day that are sort of made to order to aggravate concussion symptoms. And interestingly, and I don't know if folks are aware of this, but generally speaking, what we find is that the tolerance for physical activity, your ability to engage in physical activity without developing headaches or worsening symptoms or tiredness or dizziness, that often actually improves faster than your ability to handle mental effort, like, the academic side or social stress, things like that. And we all know that when we're testing athletes to go back to play, we're really just testing their physical tolerance for physical exertion. But the most recent guidelines say that a child should be able to tolerate school before we start the return to play process. And Matt, I think I forgot to put that slide in because I wanted to make sure I made that point. But so anyway, when we think about how do we know when someone's recovered, well, we have a process where we don't just ask them how they feel when they've been sitting at home for 2 days. We have to see what happens when they get into school, when they start to exercise. And that's how we verify recovery, is by seeing how the person responds to stress. So when we look at our current guidelines for return to play, basically you start out, you're pulled out because we want to pull you out. We want to make sure you don't get hurt again until you're recovered. We keep an eye on you because we know things can get worse. And then when you're symptom free, we start the process of verifying that those symptoms aren't going to come back with physical challenge. But notice that return to play guidelines focus entirely, maybe coordination puts a little bit of cognitive load, but the focus on return to play, and this is the progression that you're all familiar with, I hope, at this point. And there's 24 hours between here, and you got to wait and make sure that you haven't kicked up the symptoms, because if you did, that tells us they're not recovered. And this is working really well. I think people got this concept. But notice it's all focused on physical exertion for the most part, right? Which is why under the most recent Berlin guidelines, they've talked about how a student needs to be back in school and tolerating school before we start that process. Let's make sure that the mental is there. Then we can verify physical and get them back into contact. That's a new idea. The other thing that's new out of the Berlin guidelines, so I say Berlin, There have been 4 or 5 international conferences on sports concussion in Berlin. The last 2 have been Berlin, and last was in 2016. So these guidelines are from the Berlin 2016, but the first one was in Vienna in 2001. So there have been several in between. International Consensus Conference on How to Manage Sports Concussion. Never really saying about school till the most recent one, and this is also a new idea. We used to really rest kids pretty completely, even physically, until those symptoms went away. Now we know it's not a good idea. We need to get kids active, back to normal activity, including exercise. And John Letty and his colleagues in Buffalo, right here in New York State, have really been leading the charge. John Letty is now one of the authors on the consensus paper, this paper, because his group in Buffalo has really been leading the charge on recognizing how not only is it good to get kids back to exercise because it's a normal activity and they feel good doing it, especially if they're athletes, they're used to doing it, but it actually can promote recovery. We can actually use exercise as a rehabilitation tool in recovery. So we don't need to be scared of exercise. We just want to make sure that we don't overdo it. We don't overstress the brain. Keep that exercise below symptom thresholds. So, and I think, again, most of us understand this whole return to play progression. And again, it's a process to verify recovery. And you'll see why that point is important when Matt starts talking. Now, when we talk about return to school, we don't wait till symptoms go away to get them back in school, right? We don't want to. You can go to school. It's okay if you get a headache. You can still get through the day, or if you need to take a rest break. So we've learned ways to help kids in school, but we want them in school. Maybe they can only be there half a day. Maybe they can only go every other day, but we want them there. What we need to do is to keep them going in school. We don't want to pull them out for a month and then they're just getting stressed out more and more and more and more and falling behind. But we also got to get them better. So if we're not reducing the demands, if we're not managing the environment, if we're not giving them accommodations, then my job is a lot harder. And if they're stressed out because they're falling behind or not participating or being made fun of or whatever, my job's a lot harder. And if you're a physical educator or a math teacher or whatever, and they're not in your class and they're falling behind, your job's not, it's not working for you either. So we got to come together. That's the goal, is to try to come together and to develop sort of better ways to manage things. So we know with the general principles for return to school. Now, this is not return to play. This is return to school. You get them back into school as they can tolerate it. They may still have symptoms, but if they can do 2 periods, if they can do a half day, if they can do a full day, we don't let you go play football you can play 1 quarter because you're still not recovered, but you can't play the whole game, right? We're not going to do that. But school, we can do that. We want to do that. We just have to provide accommodations and some of the other things I've mentioned, right? And again, the last consensus conference was the first time they addressed this idea of, oh, we don't need to just pay attention to sports with our student athletes. We need to pay attention to school. And this is their first draft of a return to school protocol. You can see how fully developed and detailed this is. Pretty simple, again, but this is their attempt to try to now mimic what seems to have been successful with return to play. Everybody knows it. We all know the steps. Hey, maybe we can do something similar for school, right? So that kind of brings us now to, and you see we've interspersed some quotes from students, and again, we get them into school, we monitor them, we approach them. How are you feeling? Do you need a break? That's much better because they will not ask. But these simple things can make a very big difference. The understanding, the actual help reducing a headache or other symptoms can make a big difference. So this is the thrust of our presentation right here. There's a lot of confusion, and return to play has been sort of layered over onto physical education. and it's caused problems. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt now to walk through some of the ideas we have to help understand why we think it's important to recognize the difference between these two things and some beginning suggestions of how to manage that.
Great.
Okay, Matt, I'm going
Thanks.
to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brian. And if anyone has questions at any point, please feel free to use that chat, and Brian will monitor that the way I was monitoring it in the beginning. So please feel free to jump in. Brian's going to take us to the next slide, and I think that it's important to understand that return to play is not return to learn. And I had the pleasure to meet Brian a few years ago. I'm also an assistant varsity coach for soccer, and brought Brian in to talk with our families about return to play. And over the years, Brian and I have also shifted, and now we're approaching this other part of working together in this return to learn. So I've worn the hat of coach, and I'm also an elementary PE teacher. And what I'm learning, and I think it's important for everyone to know, is that one of the major differences is that as a coach, you don't bring those athletes back until they're symptom free. They got to go through all of the steps. But in return to learn, for them to come back for math or English or social studies or health or PE, they can still be having symptoms. And so how do we do that? What is the difference? Well, for return to play, everything is similar. It's the same protocol. Every student has to go through those, our athlete has to go through those same steps. But for return to learn, we're going to have our work cut out for us because we're going to have to tailor it a little bit more. We also have well-known guidelines. It's, when in doubt, you sit them out. It's been hammered. And Brian and I, with the help of all of the other folks, are trying to come up with some suggestions and guidelines as to how PE teachers can do that. And I think one of the other major differences, I know in our district, we're very fortunate to have trainers that play a huge role in return to play. Whereas return to learn, this is going to fall more on the shoulders of athletic directors, directors of physical education, and then, eventually down to the PE teachers. But this is what we do. I mean, we adapt and we differentiate. It's part of what we do regularly in PE if we're doing our jobs right. I'm going to ask Brian to go to the next slide, where we're going to talk about some of the challenges that he and I and the group have really discussed over the past, it seems like months, it could even be years. And we've mentioned that return to play often gets used in districts. I know our district is trying to work through that. I have a student who has a concussion because he fell off his bike. He's in second grade. He's supposed to come back to PE, but he can't because the note says that he's out. And we put him in a return to play protocol. And we're waiting for him to go through all of those steps before he can return. That is a challenge. That's something we need to work on. We, of course, are concerned, and the challenge is we don't want them to re-injure themselves. A huge challenge that Brian and I have talked about a lot is that often healthcare providers send a note that says, student had concussion, no PE. And then that student could sit, and especially our students that are out for 2, 3, 4 weeks, this is a problem. And so one thing I've noticed, and something we're trying to leverage is when I first started teaching, we might have a student who comes in and has a broken arm, and the note said, student has broken arm, out of PE. And we've gotten to the point where we can talk with our healthcare providers and our nurse, and we can say, listen, if the student has a broken arm, can't they still do lower body? Can't they still use their legs? And we've gotten to the point now where the notes are coming in and saying, student has broken arm, avoid contact, may do activities for lower body. And I think we can leverage that as we go through this process with healthcare providers that specify what students can and can't do when they return to us with symptoms. Another challenge we've mentioned already is the lack of uniformity in guidelines. And then I think the other is space and the supervision. Every district brings, do you have a wellness room at the high school or don't you? Do you have outdoor space? Do you not? Can you send a kid into the hallway or can you not? So those are some things we're going to have to try to solve. And we do have some suggestions. I know they're coming. The next slide are some opportunities. And I think these are real positive ones. Number one, we want our students to come back to PE as soon as possible. We have new standards that just came out, brand new PE standards, although the second bullet there is not brand new, it's just where it's placed now in the standards. Standard 5 says that students will recognize the value of physical activity for overall wellness. And we could stop right there if we wanted to for this return to learn PE, because this is an opportunity for us with the student, with the family, with the nurse, with Dr. Rieger or someone like that, if necessary, to help this student understand by coming back to PE with symptoms, how they feel and learn about themselves over the next week or two as they recover by still learning through being physical. And there's a variety of ways that can happen. Brian noted that another opportunity is that the research shows that getting them back is helpful. It's going to help them heal. Now, I don't think anyone should walk away saying that Brian and I are suggesting that PE teachers should be therapists. We're not the doctors, but it's an added benefit. It is 100% an added benefit that if we get them learning our subject again, it's going to help them to heal quicker. One note that is important, and I'm glad Brian put it in, is that the concussion law states that students can't return to athletics. Athletic activity is by New York State Ed defined as those sports, as athletic activity, not PE. It's a separate thing. And another opportunity, again, is to connect with those families. And Brian and I have had discussions about this, that families are sharing with him and students are sharing with him how stressed they are to not be involved, and we can help them to get there. So we came up with some guidelines. Brian's going to go to the next slide. And I hope that what you take away from this is that we tried to make it in a similar format to return to play, because we know that it's landing on coaches and ADs and PE teachers that are already familiar with return to play. So you're going to just see some similarity in terms of phases and suggested activities and things like that to consider. But the big picture is we want to prepare our students and our PE teachers to be ready for the return to learn. That's step one. Then there's this middle where the students are going to progress through, and then they're going to exit, and they're going to return to all activities. So Brian's going to go to the next slide. And I am not going to go word for word. And I'm happy, and I know Brian would too, we would be happy to share this with you if you wanted to look at it in more detail. But the takeaway for me in phase one is that this is where you are connecting with the healthcare provider. You are connecting in a way where we're building relationships with healthcare providers so that they know that when they come to your district or they see a student that's out with a concussion, that we are going to try to bring them back prior to being symptom-free, and that we want their approval to do that, knowing that we have a plan to do that safely. And then the second big takeaway is this whole phase is about communicating with parents and students. Understand your student, what bothers them, what doesn't bother them. This is where there's going to be some legwork, but again, I think that this is our job as teachers in general. You get to know your students. I'm going to ask Brian to go to the next phase, and this is 2 through 6, which is where students are progressing. And I would say this is the idea of what we're suggesting you could do from phases 2 through 6. And in these phases, the takeaway from me is that, or the takeaway for me is that you are bringing the student back in to be physically active. That's the start. And if those symptoms come back, then maybe they tone it back down. What could that look like? It could look like walking the halls with a pedometer. It could look like being on a treadmill in the wellness room, even though maybe their unit is not to be in the wellness room. Maybe it is moving them off to the side in your gym in a protected spot where they're going to do something light, like a light yoga, but you're keeping them safe. And so, yes, we're differentiating. It's going to take work, but it's something that can be done. And you can see as you progress, you're getting them maybe a little bit more involved. As you get to levels 4 and 5, what the idea is, and again, we are hoping for feedback and thoughts, but the idea is you start them with individual work, whether that's a kindergartner who's working on juggling, hand-eye coordination with a scarf on their own, all the way up to a 16 or 17-year-old that's at the high school that could be doing individual work on a skill in a safe way, even though the rest of the class is involved in a team sport. And then maybe they go to partner work. So now that kindergartner is tossing and catching with a partner in a safe spot, and they're still having access to the curriculum just the way all the other students are, but at their level. And then finally, in that level, phase 6, we're getting them to the point where they're in a small group. We're still limiting contact or collision, and you might have to make adjustments. Maybe if I'm in a volleying unit at the younger ages, I'm going to put them off to the side, and we're going to use a balloon as we work on volleying just to see where that student is, and my other students are still working on that same skill. In the last phase, I'm just checking my time to make sure I'm leaving time for discussion. In the last phase, Brian, I'm going to ask you to go to 7 if you could. This is where the student is now able to do these activities, is not showing signs and symptoms, and they're able to return to PE full. Now, one of the questions we get that it is not a simple black or white answer is, and you might be thinking this now, well, how do I know when to go from 2 to 3? How do I go from 3 to 4? How do I go from 4 to 5, et cetera? This has to be discussion-based. You have to be able to talk with the student after class. Maybe you're seeing your student every other day. Maybe it's a check-in. Maybe it's a Google form. Maybe it's a phone call home with the family. So that's going to be individualized based on departments or maybe the school culture and how you handle those communications. It's also important that conversations would be had with the nurse. So I think that the investment is worth it so that students aren't sitting out for long, long periods of time. The final piece I want to touch on, we've created just a start of an FAQ. And these are some questions that we think might be on people's minds. What do I do if, where should my student do these activities, right? What should they do it? Well, hopefully with you in the gym, if possible. And if they can't, right, then what do I do? This is where you're going to have to understand the resources, the facilities that you have at your disposal. Some real world examples for me would be, and I wish I could have done this with a previous student, would be to literally set him up in the gym, coned off with his own space, and give him a yoga mat to do his work. And I could manage that based on the unit so that he could be safe. If the gym is not safe, could I have him walking in the halls or not? Could I have him go to an auxiliary gym room and join somebody else where they could do some work? So there's loads of options there. What should I do if noise or light bothers my student? They can't handle. I'm trying to do a rhythms unit or a dance unit up at the high school, and we're using music. How about some earplugs? How about some sunglasses or something to shade those bright lights in the gym for them as your first step? And then if not, move to an alternate location. And then the final question that we get a bunch is, why is this protocol different? Why is return to play different than return to PE? And again, it's written right there for you. We're trying not to wait until they're symptom-free. We're trying to help promote recovery while still gaining access to school into the PE curriculum. Return to play is not that. It's to verify that they're symptom-free to return to potentially contact interscholastic athletics. So Brian, I think I hit on most of the things we wanted to hit on there. And I know Brian and I are both hoping to take questions or solicit feedback. We are open to you being critical. Tell us where we're missing the boat, or what challenges you might be feeling right now. If your district had a student with PE, what challenges would you have tomorrow morning, non-COVID related, to getting them back into PE?
Matt and Brian, I'm just going to make a quick comment, then I'll let everyone else talk about and look at the protocol. So this is a paradigm shift. That's what everyone needs to understand. It's a shift from return to play to return to physical education. That's the first thing. Your last bullet points that out. That's what people have to understand. That is critical. And why do this? We have a great vehicle for return to athletics, but not return to physical education. I would say if everyone on this this chat right now, or this presentation, there's 35, 36 different physical education programs. They're all doing it different. Why can't there be guidelines in place for physical education, and we take care of students and not have the phys ed teachers so frustrated of what to do with this student coming back to physical education? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And I just want to make the point that as a psychologist, many of the high school kids in particular who go through a prolonged recovery from concussion, really it's one of the first times in their life, especially if they're a good student, a good athlete, like I said. It's the first time in their life sometimes they have to deal with this level of stress. It's the first time they can't do things that they want to do. You know, they can't just sort of barrel through it or add something to their schedule. You know, they have to learn to slow down, to stop, to make difficult choices about what to focus on and what not. But many, many of these students come out the other side of that, talking to me about how they feel like they learned a lot, that the silver lining is that they really never understood how much stress they were putting themselves under, and that they had to learn to deal with that. So this is not, you know, this is a real opportunity with kids going through a very difficult time when they're actually very open in a way to education and to taking something away from this, because it's painful. And, you know, pain can be a very good teacher. So I really think that the opportunity, as Matt pointed out, for students to learn something about themselves, how to manage an injury, how to listen to their bodies, how to communicate, how to advocate for themselves. There's really seems like a lot that would fall right in your, I mean, I'm not a physical educator, but from what I'm learning, this really ticks a lot of good boxes and really is an opportunity. So we got one comment so far. Are you able to share these slides with us? I'm certainly happy to do that. Matt, you know, if you're
Sure.
okay.
Yep, of course.
So Matt has a copy of this presentation. So Matt, I'll leave it to you to.
Yep, I'll get it to Jessica and or Ron, and then we can distribute as necessary. And I just hope people would know that, especially the phases there. I mean, definitely a draft, something that we keep tinkering with based on the feedback that we get from the work with our group that Ron is a part of. But yes, absolutely.
And the question that just came in, are the phases posted somewhere? So I'm going to assume this question means like, they're posted here in our presentation because we're making them up. So they're not posted as part of a paper anywhere, although my intent would be to try to convince Matt and Ron and some other people to join me in writing a paper when we get to that point, and putting these in some kind of a journal and put them out there to the literature to share. Someone raised their hand.
That would be me.
Okay, I don't know if I had to do something, but you go ahead, Michael.
I'll take care of that for you. Correct me if I'm wrong, the return to play, is that from state ed? As a reason for my asking that question.
No, so the return to play protocol comes out of the International Consensus Conference beginning in Vienna in 2001. And honestly, it's really no different than it was in 2001, that 6-step progression. The New York State law that was passed in 2012 says that no athlete can return to play until they're symptom-free. They can't go back to athletic activity. State ed defines athletic activity as interscholastic sports, meaning you can go back to PE, including exercise, because it's not athletic activity, before you're symptom-free. State ed's guidelines, concussion management guidelines, do refer to the Berlin Protocol for return to play. They do refer to it, but because it's universally accepted, Michael, really. But it's not like it's not unique to New York State. It's not unique to state ed. It's international.
The reason I ask is because I think what you have is a very good thing. I think it's very good. I'm wondering if it could be, in a sense, a position statement somehow. Again, and suggest to state ed or whatnot, because you have hundreds of districts in New York State, and maybe we're standardizing it like you're trying to do. Would be a good idea. I fully agree with what you're doing. I love it. I'd like to be part of that. But it sounds like you know where you're going with this.
Well, and Matt can jump in on this too, because again, I think you guys have more of a sense of, what you need kind of to cover your back when you're doing stuff like this in the schools. But that has definitely been our intent, Michael, was to first develop it and then be able to take it and say, look, we've done our homework. We've talked to experts. We've talked to medical people. We've talked to physical educators. We've talked to school administrators. And, these people are on board. How can we make this more part of standard guidelines? So Matt, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say that you're right on, Brian, and Michael, great point. And I think we're grateful that Ron is part of the group. So we're staying connected with New York State AFERD that way to see what's the best way to leverage that. Is it a position statement? Is it presenting this in March at the virtual conference? Is it also, this is obviously under the umbrella of Bianis, and they have connections with state ed. And so we know some of the folks there. So I think those are absolutely all on our radar. But before we go hand it out, we want to try to make sure it is usable for everybody in a way that we have a diverse group, and we understand that the state is big and diverse, and we want to make sure it's detailed enough for everybody, but leaves room for flexibility at the same time.
Sure, right. Thank you.
And
Yeah,
honestly,
thank you.
if this group wants to drive that train, I mean, I don't think Matt and I feel like we need to own this. Bianis doesn't feel like we need to own it. If we could, I don't know who's a better stakeholder than this group to go to state ed. And the High School Association has been working closely with the Brain Injury Association for years. We co-lobbied the original concussion law. And I think the High School Association and Sports Association, recognizes that they'd rather be part of the conversation about concussion management rather than having it delivered to them. And I think you guys would feel similarly about this. You're being proactive in promulgating these guidelines or proposing these or endorsing them, so we're all for that, Michael. It's a great idea. And Ron, I don't know if you, from your standpoint, wanted to jump in too.
I do a couple things. I do think that, we started with this presentation, which is well attended, and you guys, Brian and Matt, have done an excellent job. I think maybe the next step may be going to our full membership of New York State AFERD, so 700 different districts and physical education teachers across our state can be aware of this, because this protocol can make every physical education teacher's job so much easier, just as the return to play did. That really helped us. This can help us. I hope everyone understands why we're doing this. There's a couple people too, I think, Brian, that, I see Tilsa on there and some other people that maybe want to be a part of this committee. But I want to put a guy on the spot, and that's Denny Freeze. And Denny, I just curious what's going on in that brain of yours right now, and what are your thoughts? You got to unmute yourself.
I think I said this is the next natural step, Brian. I don't know how we missed it in the beginning,
Right.
but I think our plate was pretty full back then, just trying to get off the ground.
Well, I think
Yeah.
Denny too, I think because there's such an overlap between like so many coaches or physical educators, and there's just such an overlap. But and I've been focusing on getting kids back in school forever. And it's like when I finally kind of realized what the problem was, I agree, Denny. It's like, why didn't I figure that out before? It took a group of us, and it wasn't me who figured it out. It was really, I think it's the conversation we all had
Yes.
that we realized that. So
I think one of the important links is one of the things we started off with, and that is the link to the health office in our schools. And make sure that the teachers and administrators are in direct coordination with them, because they are certainly the backup for us, if not the beginning stage, to let us know this child's ready for the first phase of getting back.
yeah, and I do want to say too, just because I know people are interested in maybe getting the slides and stuff, but we don't want people going out and saying, these are the new guidelines for return to PE. It's not there yet, right? You can talk about this, get a conversation going through your organization, give your feedback to Ron, and he can feed it back to our committee. I just want to be, make sure we're careful about that. This is not a universally accepted consensus document the way return to play is at this point. That's our goal, but we're not there yet.
And I think we have to have a lot of trust in each of the kids. You have to know each kid to know their tolerance for pain, their ability to get back, their will to get back into action. Some won't want to, and some are faking it just to get back into it. So you got to be very careful on both ends of that spectrum. I think it's needed as a starting point.
Hey, Matt, Ron Whitcomb, what would you ideal world, next step, Matt Murphy?
I would say next step is receive some feedback from this group, critical, brief and honest. What are we missing? What challenges especially are we missing? Real world, not down to the ground, your PE teachers, what are we missing? That to me is step one. After that, go back with the committee and try to craft something that's helpful for people, and then be ready. I certainly know we could do it by March, would be to be ready for New York State AFERD conference and presenting something. We could even run, I don't know when the next one for you all would be, but we could come to another COA and shrink the presentation and share just the protocol. We could provide some background, but that to me would be the next logical step: feedback, and then try to reach the membership in full with something a little more polished. And specifically, Ron, too, I think some things that we're already thinking about helping people with, I saw the question for training. Number one would be a sample letter that you could use in your district to connect with the health office and local healthcare providers. That's one thing we could provide the membership. Number two would be, get an elementary PE high school teacher that is forward thinking and really hammer out, 5 to 10 activities at every level that would be useful for PE teachers legitimately. I did those, but it would be great to get, and we all know people we could get there, but a small few. So those to me would be the next steps, Ron.
And those are, you summed it up extremely well. Love what you said. The one thing I will disagree with you, you said polished. I think you and this committee have really worked diligently, and it has been a process to polish it as much as you can. I agree with the feedback, but I think everyone on this Zoom meeting doesn't realize the process and the work that you have put in to get to this process. And truly has been a process and well thought out. So kudos to you. And I think we're going along the correct steps.
Great.
Absent any other more questions, I just want to echo Denny's last point one more time, which is that, concussion, there's a saying, when you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion. That every single one is different and every student is different. So the concussion happens to a different student and each concussion is different. So you put that together and it's very, very individualized. I was listening to Matt talk about, juggling or lying down on a mat, and, one student could tolerate that one of those activities without a problem, the other couldn't. And you don't know that till you try it. So if you're not, as an educator, prepared to have that kind of communication and interaction with the student, this is not going to go well. So I definitely want to echo that point. And Denny, I guess the way you said it made me think you kind of, as a teacher, you need to know your students already. Like, who's the one who's going to be most likely to be putting a little bit of their own spin on this and get what they can out of it versus somebody who's, wouldn't be caught dead complaining. And that's the advantage you all have compared to me in a clinic, is your students, you interact with them regularly over the course of a school year. So.
And I think too, Brian, just to sum up a little bit, I think it was great that there were so many folks here, and like Rod said, so many different districts. If you're tuning in, I'm gonna guess that it is on your radar, or it's a concern or of interest to you, or a problem to solve at your school. And I just think it's a no-brainer opportunity for physical education to be on the forefront of this and helping these students get access back to our curriculum, get access back to our classroom, which is the gym, and all of their peers, and helping them to recover quicker. I think it's just it's a win-win all the way around. It just needs to be done right.
Gentlemen, great presentation. I think it was well thought out. You went step-by-step process, let us understand what a concussion is, and then brought us the return to physical education. Just very nice job. I'm impressed.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Ron. So,
Matt and Brian, thanks a lot for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
sure, our pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Just a reminder to everyone, if you didn't sign in to the chat, to do that. And Ron, any conference announcements for the day?
Just, you know what, we've got Thursday and Friday. I think the sessions are, and I'm prejudiced and I don't mind saying that, they're outstanding. Get to them as you can. Friday is a recap. It's not really a recap. It's to get some raffles, some prizes, have some fun, and then a 30-second closure. So far, what I've seen has been just spectacular. Everyone have a great afternoon.
Hi, Brian. Hi,
Take
Ron.
care.
Take care. Danny,
Yep.
thanks for joining us.
I know.
Why is this thing? It went 100 times better. I thought no one.
Hey, Greg.
What's up, Denise? How are you?
I don't know. Is this over?
Yes.
Wow. I just figured I'd tune in with you and say hello. What's going on?
You know, same old stuff, different circumstances.
Oh, I hear you. Now, you guys moved to January, right?
No, we're November.
Oh, okay. All right. So you have a little bit more time. We're in the heat of it. That's
Yeah.
why I've been nonstop. I was just, in the administration offices. It's been crazy.
Yeah, I'm sure.
A good crazy. It's good to see your face. I will see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right.
See you this weekend, maybe too.
Yes, definitely. I will be there Saturday night. So I'll be
Okay.
there Saturday and Sunday. Good to see you. Okay.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.